Happy Black History Month, even though it's the shortest month of the year. Welcome Black. Welcome back. Welcome Black. How y'all doing? I hope everyone is doing good. I hope everyone is feeling good, enjoying these last couple days of Black History Month, even though I feel like on this channel, it's Black History Year, it's Black History Forever. So yes, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited because we're going to be talking about the term POC, why some people don't like it, why some people are trying to maybe change it to BIPOC, why people are like, let's not use POC, why some people love the term POC. So I'm really excited. Go ahead and get comfortable, get a little couch, chair if you are, anywhere where it is cold. I really hope you are safe. I know Texas is really struggling right now. So please just be comfortable as you possibly can, and enjoy this video. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe button, and also hit the bell icon to be notified when I post. I post every other Sunday, so look out for your girl Aziza on Sundays. We're gonna hit the intro and we're gonna get right into it. So before I get into kind of like the problem and the historical context of the word, I want to just clarify so we're all on the same page. POC is an acronym, and it stands for People of Color. Now, I think people like POC. Even sometimes I'll say it even on my channel if you watch some of my videos, which hopefully you will. And I'll just say POC just because it's quick to say, even though, it's not always great. But sometimes if you're just okay, POC, you don't want to say marginalized folks, underrepresented folks who, experience racism in America. That all is essentially people of color, just people who are non-white. Now, I also think people like it because I think the of color thing is really kind of trendy to say when it's oh, this new chef of color, this new politician of color, this new, when describing people who are non-white in these spaces, it's just easier to say oh, they're a POC, they're a person of color. Now, I want to get into this word BIPOC because I had never heard of this word probably until 2020. I didn't learn about it in class or anything like that. I think I learned about it from people saying it, articles, Twitter. This is one way to say it. Apparently there's multiple ways to say it. There's I don't know. There's just multiple ways to say it. I've heard BIPOC. So BIPOC is another acronym, and it represents Black, Indigenous, and POC, people of color. So people wanted to use this word BIPOC because the thing with POC is that it puts all of these underrepresented groups under this umbrella. But a lot of times, and I'm going to get into this later, Indigenous folks are oftentimes just totally erased, and Black folks have to deal with very specific types of oppression. So it's kind of okay, well, let's take out Black and Indigenous folks out of the POC because it's we want to, change the narrative, and we want to, be our own thing. So that's what BIPOC is. So if you ever see BIPOC, it's just Black, Indigenous, and POC. So in terms of terminology as well, there are terms such as marginalized, non-white, but something that I didn't realize, and I was doing research for this video, is that, marginalized and non-white, those terms kind of center whiteness. Now, personally, I'm okay with non-white. I feel because it's just so clear, it's non-white. I would be okay with saying non-white, but again, I do recognize that does kind of center whiteness. So those are terms that I think also people would say if you're talking about what a person of color is, how some people would classify a person of color. They may say a marginalized group, marginalized communities, or they may say non-white. So something I want to bring into context is the fact that for African Americans, terminology has been so important. In the beginning of the 1900s, obviously Black people were referred to as slaves. Really, it's just slaves or the N-word that I'm not even gonna say on this channel, but slaves and various things like that. Then over time, as Black people started to, immigrate into society, it kind of became more, okay, coloreds. You'd see the white only signs, the colored only signs, and oftentimes colored people would also encompass other ethnic minorities too, but for the most part it was like black people, and other ethnic minorities would have, unfortunately, slangs that people would refer to them, and that would just be the norm of the time. Then throughout time, it changed to maybe like Afro-Americans, blacks, just like the blacks, of course. And then now I think it's moved into more of like African Americans, black people, and POC, and various things like this. Just bringing into context terminology. So all that to say, I think for black people, it's just been such a long journey. And I think there even might still be some older people in this world who are like blacks or colors or whatever. And I'll say I'm a TA, and even sometimes I would grade my students' papers, and they would refer to black people when they're talking about like oppression and writing these papers as like coloreds, and I'm just like, we don't say that anymore. Like, and the thing is like some of these old texts that we'll still read say coloreds or blacks or whatever. So I think sometimes people are like, okay, but of course it's ignorant, and I think everyone knows not to say coloreds. But just all this to say that there has been kind of a history of terminology for black people kind of being a way to keep us down and be like, oh, those whatever's over there, those N-words over there, those colors, y'all stay over there, X, Y, and Z. So I think terminology is just very, very important. And I think there are people who would even be like, well, don't call me black because I'm not a color. Don't call me brown because I'm not a color. There might be people who are like, well, I'm not African American. I'm, whatever. I'm Nigerian American. I'm, various things like this. So, everyone has whatever terminology that they feel comfortable with. And hopefully if you say like, okay, this person is a black person, and they're like, actually, I don't like to be identified as black. I want to be identified as African American, like they'll say it. But just to keep this in mind also, like terminology again for black folks is just so, it really is a whole thing, understandably. So now we're going to get into some historical context and thinking about like how terms have kind of come about and where. So the term race has essentially evolved to what we understand it as it is today, as the United States has evolved and come into fruition. And the term race was deeply connected to the evolution of the two other words, white and slave. So all that to say, the words race, white, and slave were all used by Europeans in the 1500s and brought to North America. And even though these words were used in Europe, they don't have necessarily the exact same translation or meaning as they would today in America. So I wanted to bring this up just so we really understand that the words and identifications were something that the white man brought over. People didn't necessarily use these words race, white, slaves in North America. This is something that Europeans brought here. So I just really want to emphasize that, because I do think that people are like, well, racism is a very American-born thing, and it's like, well, racism and wanting to, identify yourself in a certain way is a European thing that was brought to North America. And in that formation, that became something that became like the Americas. But all that to say, it just wasn't always like that. When the Native Americans were here and they were living their life and living it up, they weren't thinking about who's a slave, who's white, what's race. So by the beginning of the 19th century, the term the white identity, or the term white, related to or designated a privileged landholding, usually male status. So having whiteness meant you had clear rights in society, while not being white meant that your freedoms, your property, your rights were unstable, if not non-existent. And this is really significant because, of course, as I've stated, like terminology is so important, but the terminology around this time period, white being synonymous with so much power and stability and freedom and things like this, meant obviously everything that wasn't white was not. But it just really gets at the fact that there's so much racism that can be also embedded in things that you wouldn't even think about in terms of words. Like, there's always that thing where it's like, if you look up the definition of white and the definition of black, black is like black hole, dark, scary, whatever, and white is synonymous oftentimes with purity and various things like that, and cleanliness and polish and various things like this. So it's just really important to think about how these terms became so much synonymous with white people being up here and everyone else just being like down bad. So what happens in the early 20th century is that the term white now starts to encompass various groups, and these groups include Italians and Eastern European immigrants. And the thing is, other groups like Chinese, indigenous folks, Latinx folks, black people were now outside of this gate of whiteness and would struggle as then and continuing on and still to this day would struggle to gain some of the same privileges that white folks were given, like voting, citizenship, access to the nation's wealth, freedom, really, just freedoms that, of course, were given to white folks and were given to people. All you had to do was come to America and be an American. So with this historical context, I kind of just wanted to bring into the equation why some folks would feel the need and desire to classify themselves outside of whiteness. Because for so long throughout history, it's been like white and everything else, everyone else. But some folks are just like, okay, well, what about us? Like, of course, as we know, everywhere but America, and honestly, even in America now, white folks are not the majority anymore. And outside the US, white folks have never really been the majority except for Europe. But even in Europe, it's not really looking like that as much as it used to. So, there are places where white people would be the marginalized groups, but of course, because of power, dominance, and whatever, white people have the privilege and access to get to these higher up positions. So all that to say, I think people of color, POC, BIPOC, these terms kind of have just come about and talking about like, well, who are we then? We're the other, but let's give the other a bit of a name and a bit of a story and some kind of unity. So now that we've kind of covered the historical context, I'm kind of going to get into what the problem of this term is. So my personal biggest issue with the term POC is that it's vague and everyone has a different idea of who is a POC and who fits in the POC. Now, in terms of just my just off the bat term, because it says person of color, I would think, okay, so it's essentially anyone who's not white. Anyone who's not white is a POC. That's what I may think, and that's what I think a lot of people think. And I think some people would be like, I'm not really considering various groups or whatever. That's just my issue with the word. I just think everyone has different opinions about who should be under the umbrella of POC for valid reasons. So I think because of that, that's why I would like to get away from the term, because there are people who are like, I'm POC, and it's like, but are you? Would everyone think you are? So yeah. Now, I think another reason why a lot of people may not like the term POC is because it's not really encompassing of everyone's struggle. And that's where I talked about earlier, the BIPOC, BIPOC kind of came out, because it's like I've stated, indigenous folks are constantly just being absolutely erased when it comes to, conversations about racism, conversations about, oppression and things like that. And then Black people have to deal with a very specialized type of racism just because, of our history in America, being slaves and then having to work our way to freedom and still being oppressed with police brutality. So I think that because it's not encompassing of everyone's kind of struggle, not that a term should be, but it's just kind of if some people are gonna feel like, okay, I'm not a POC, I'm not the same as you because I'm living a different kind of life than you are, I think that is a cause for concern. And I think why a lot of people are really starting to kind of not like the term as much, because it's kind of like, well, if you're not gonna acknowledge that my struggle is different from yours, I don't want to be in your umbrella. I don't want to be known as a POC, because it's like we're not the same. And aside to that very point, I think sometimes when I started to see this, it would be on Twitter or just random things, when it would be a Latinx person being racist towards a Black person, or even maybe an Asian person being racist towards a Latinx person, and people would be like, this is why we're not all POC, you know. And I think it's the fact also that just because you are under the umbrella of POC, that doesn't mean that you can't be racist, and you can't be just as racist or problematic as a white person being racist or problematic towards a Latinx person or a Black person. But it's like, if we can do the same kind of harm to, you know, one another as white people do to us, then let's just not use the term POC. Let's just not classify us all as the same, which again is valid. But what I will say is that as I was kind of doing research for this, I do think that when it comes to coalition building, I think that people and activists and, you know, people who are just really, again, into coalition building, kind of bringing everyone together, kind of like the term POC because it brings everyone kind of together and is like, okay, we have to fight the powers that be. We are all seen as people of color, whether, you know, whatever. So let's kind of like fight together. Let's kind of like acknowledge one another's differences, but how we all essentially like should and could band together to like fight the powers that be and various things like that. So just wanted to bring that in because there are people obviously in coalition spaces or people who just kind of want to be allies and, you know, bring communities together that are like, okay, well, we should have a unifying word because we do kind of all experience some form of oppression, whatever that is. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as to why some people do like the term and would like to and see the benefit of wanting something that kind of is unifying like BIPOC or whatever. So in terms of tips, I just have kind of like 2 tips. I think the first tip for me would just be whatever you say, whatever you want to say, if you want to keep saying POC, if you want to keep saying BIPOC, if you want to say non-white, whatever, just acknowledge that just because, you know, there are a lot of people in this world who are not white doesn't mean we all experience the same struggle. We shouldn't necessarily act as if we're all under the same umbrella in terms of the fact that we're all experiencing the same kind of racism or the same kind of oppression, because that is absolutely not true. A lot of people are like, well, we need to acknowledge how we're different and acknowledge our different struggles before we can come together. So again, use whatever word you want to use, but yeah, just make sure that if you are trying to unify or whatever, just acknowledge the differences. Acknowledge the differences within the fractions of POC. And I actually lied. I have 3 tips. So that was number 1. Number 2, a big one, I think, oh yeah, I got new nails. I just had to show y'all. Black-owned press-on nail company, by the way. Quick little shout out. I'm gonna put the name right here. Pretty Impressed. Black-owned press-on nails. But tip number 2, try not to say all POC. I also think that might be where the issue comes in, because I think sometimes people will be like, well, my boss, you know, told me that my hair was unprofessional because it was in an afro and she's a POC. So, you know, she should, or, you know, all POC need to or should, blah, blah, blah. I just think maybe we need to stop saying like all POC, and maybe if we're gonna just say POC, it's mainly just a way to kind of like, or BIPOC, a way to kind of like say people who are not white. But I think we also need to get away from saying like all POC, because again, just because you're a POC doesn't mean you can't be racist or you can't, you know, do these various things. And I think assuming that all POC are like the same and, you know, how we're like shocked when a person of color does something racist, I think we need to get away from that. So yeah, that'd be tip number 2. Try not to say all POC. Try not to generalize everyone under the umbrella. And tip number 3, do your research and say what you want to say. I just say, you know, whatever, maybe you watch this and you're just like, okay, yeah, actually, I don't want to say POC anymore. Then maybe it's like, okay, what do you want to say in terms of a way to classify folks who are non-white? Maybe you want to say non-white. Maybe you want to say marginalized. Maybe you know, are like, okay, but I just think, you know, whatever you want to say, just do your research. Make sure it's something that is like based on something that you know and have like done some research about so you feel comfortable. Because when you do, I just noticed when you do start switching up languages and terminologies, I do think people will ask questions of like, what is that? So I think it's important to be ready to be like, oh, like BIPOC stands for whatever, or, you know, when I say this word, I mean this. So, and I do think that, you know, like I said, I didn't learn about BIPOC in a class. I learned about it from like an article and people talking about it. So I do think with words and terminologies, whatever you start saying, that becomes what you say, and that becomes what other people might start to think about and say as well. So, you know, I just think we all are very important in how we spread terminology and how we start saying things. You know, we all know certain phrases and songs that, you know, got popular on TikTok or whatever just because people saying it and it's being shared with social media and things like that. So all that to say, yeah, I just say make an informed decision. And just say what it is, but, you know, be ready to explain if somebody is like, what is that? So thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you got something, learned something, you know, from this video and just took something away. Please don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, let people know why POC may not be the move anymore, or maybe why you feel like, okay, I feel comfortable saying it, or whatever you feel. Let me know in the comments how you feel, if you feel like you're gonna keep using the term, if you feel like I don't really like it, but what other terms maybe that you might feel like using. I may start doing that too. If you watch my previous videos, don't think I'm fake. It's just that sometimes it's quick to say. So again, just drop in the comments, let me know how you're feeling. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Check me out. I also post my videos on IGTV, on my Instagram at azebraa with 2 A's at the end. So thank you so much. I'll see you next time, and happy Black History Month.